Hello, everyone. My name is Vish Khanna, and I currently live in Edmonton, Alberta. I'm from Ontario originally, but I live in Edmonton now, which is to the far left of Ontario, only geographically speaking. It's my thrill to be with you today. I'm a journalist. I covered comedy for many years for Exclaim magazine, where I'm an assistant editor and of the comedy section. I also have a podcast called Creative Patrol, where I talk to comedians and musicians and authors and all sorts of people. So very immersed in comedy myself. I want to welcome you to the Learning and Fun Professional Development Program at the Toronto Sketch Comedy Festival. And I want to thank CBC for supporting this program. And now I'm very excited to introduce our illustrious panel. And so that I don't screw something up, I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and potentially even tag a colleague at the end of their introduction so that they feel prompted to introduce themselves as well. So I'm going to begin with Glenn. Glenn, can you introduce yourself, contextualize yourself, and tell the people who you are?
I'm Glenn Sumi. My pronouns are he and him. I think we're supposed to visually describe what we look like. Middle-aged guy of East Asian descent, close-cropped head of black hair, and I'm currently in front of a backdrop of the Northern Lights because my condo is a total mess and I don't want to embarrass myself. I am currently the acting managing editor at Now Magazine, which is a Toronto news and entertainment weekly. And during the pandemic, I have written about a whole ton of stuff, especially when there were no performances going. But in the before times, I mostly wrote about theater and comedy and movies, and I'm happy to be here. And next to me in my Zoom box is Claire. So Claire, take it away.
Thanks, Glenn. I'm Clare Martin. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white woman in her 20s with blonde hair, but the roots are grown out. And I'm in my office / spare bedroom. So I'm the assistant comedy editor at Paste. I'm pretty new to the position, but I've been contributing to Paste comedy section for a couple of years now. And yeah, I'm based in Dublin, but originally from Seattle. So that's why I don't have a cool accent. And now I'm going to tag in Jourdain.
Hi, I'm Jourdain Searles. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black woman, kind of look like a cartoon character. I'm a comedian and I'm a journalist, but actually not often a comedy journalist, though I do cover comedy. I mostly cover film, but I love reading comedy journalism, have a lot of thoughts about it as a comedian. And I also do a comedy / film podcast called Bad Romance.
Nice. And finally, before we get to Jason, I've neglected to describe myself. I'm Vish. I'm a brown man. I wear glasses. I go by he, him. I have hair like a wizard, an old wizard. I have salt and pepper long hair like a wizard. I think everyone here can agree I look exactly like a wizard. So I hope that helps. Just picture a tall brown man who might cast a spell on you. Okay, sorry, Jason. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, thank you. My name is Jason Zinoman, he, him. I got middle-aged, white, Jewish guy looks, black plastic glasses, eyes that are either kind of squinty or popping, with no in between. I cover. I've had a column on comedy for about 10 years, the New York Times. Before that, I covered theater. I've had a column on theater before for the Times. I also covered sports and film. So yeah, that's up.
And so I want to begin by talking about the fact that all of you illuminated the fact that you've covered other things. I mentioned music, arts, theater, literature, all sorts of forms. And there's a long history of coverage and criticism. And there are some people who, in major media outlets, there are some people who feel like comedy hasn't been given the same attention by some of these same media outlets. I wonder if we can talk about that first of all. Do you think comedy gets short shrift? And I'm actually going to begin. With Jason. We've already gotten rolling here, Jason. What do you make of that?
Well, it's undeniably true. I mean, I think if you that there, if you look at the 60s and 70s and 80s, where you have not only an incredibly fertile artistic period for comedy, but from a business point of view, the 80s, you have this huge explosion in comedy clubs all over the place. It's this massive story that really was covered, a little bit here and there, but not systematically by any publications. Not really. Even you look at the 90s with like the alt comedy boom. If you read the stories, that it's someone usually parachuting in to try to figure it out recently. And, if you compare it to, say, pop music, which there weren't always pop music critics or pop music coverage, but there was by this period, 60s, 70s, 80s. There were people who regularly covered this stuff. And it seems to me a failure, both a failure of the press artistically, but also from, covering the culture and covering the business of culture. Now, why is that? That I don't know. I'd be curious to other people to say. I mean, I have a few theories. One, I think, is that is this like a technical reason, which is that how do you cover comedy? The comedy special is now they're everywhere, but there wasn't that long ago, there weren't that many comedy specials. So how do you cover Chris Rock, who was not covered until he got into movies or TV, but he was doing great work in clubs in New York and other places. How do you cover that? Is one club set, something to review? Is it not? Do you wait for the hour? Now, there's ways to solve this problem, but I do think that it's part of the reason why they didn't cover it, because you knew how to cover movies, you knew how to cover a dance performance, you knew how to cover opera, theater, etc. So I think that's just a really banal explanation. Two, there's the, comedy didn't get the respect as an art form. And I think until that's really changed in the last, 15 years, I would say.
Yeah, fair enough.
But even that is hard to figure out, because there are other, there was periods of time when, my first book was about horror movies. And it's true that in the 70s, a lot of these horror movies in the 70s that are now considered, classics, Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, all these, they weren't reviewed very widely by mainstream outlets either. So that's part of the explanation.
Appreciate that, Jason. And I want to move on to Claire with the same question, but I will add one thing to what Jason just said, which I've experienced myself as a comedy editor, trying to get writers to contribute to the section. I got resistance saying, I don't know how to write about comedy. And in my early days reviewing live shows, I would realize that I was ruining the set, because I would try to articulate what a joke was. And there was a few years ago, I reviewed a Maria Bamford Jackie Cation show, and the review went out on Twitter from the magazine. And Jackie Cation took a moment to be like, oh my God, you're a unicorn. You reviewed a comedy show without ruining a single joke. You learn, I learned from experience not to ruin the jokes by writing them all out and getting them wrong, or whatever people were doing. That's what comedians have told me subsequently. Anyway, I just wanted to, when you said technical reason, I was wondering if that's maybe where you're coming from, that it can be difficult for people to cover it, because comedy is a lot of surprise. So a bad review is actually ruining the set for someone's tour the rest of the time. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interject. Claire, can you speak to the same question about the lack of coverage and maybe why that might occur with comedy as an art form specifically?
Yeah, well, I think part of the issue is that comedy can be defined pretty broadly. Like, there's stand-up, but then you also have sitcoms, you have TV shows, podcasts, books. So in some ways, it's like the fingers in a lot of different pies. And it's like, okay, well, if someone else is covering that already, then like comedy can get kind of lost in the shuffle. Tried to explain this to a colleague once, and I used a bad analogy, but I'm going to try it again, which is, it's like if someone gets hurt in a crowd, and because there's so many people around, you assume someone else is going to help out. So like, I think sometimes that can happen with comedy, where like, because there's so much overlap, it can be a bit forgotten. And then as for like people not knowing how to write about comedy, that's definitely a thing. So like I started out at Paste as an intern, and I initially focused more on music, but none of the interns really wanted to write about comedy. And I was like, okay, I'll take a stab at this.
Yeah.
And basically it's whoever's willing to try to write about it without ruining the jokes. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, Claire. Jourdain, can you speak to this?
Yeah, I would agree that people really don't know how to write about comedy. They don't really know how to talk about comedy. Like I've been working as a critic for, oh God, like 4 years now. And what I have learned is that whenever a new comedy special comes out and then the discourse starts circulating, it's some of the worst shit I've ever seen in my life. Nobody knows what they're doing. Nobody knows how to say anything. It's well, because like so much of, and I think that part of it is just that like so much of, especially in the wake of stuff like The Daily Show and the Colbert Report, so much of comedy is connected to like politics and culture, and people, I've noticed lately, people have a lot of trouble talking about comedy in a way that's not directly connected to like a wider cultural critique. I mean, that's important, but people don't seem to be like asking the question, like, is it funny? What's funny about it? It's all just like, this is the material that someone talked about, and this is what it means in a political context. And then that's it. We don't know. By the end, it's just like, is it funny? Should I watch it? Is it going to be like an informational thing? It's very frustrating. I will say that like I write about film mostly, but when I write about comedy, it's much harder. I would say that one of the hardest pieces that I wrote was about the second season of I Think You Should Leave, which I think is brilliant. But it was like, I watched it and I was like, I think that it's brilliant. But being able to talk about why it's brilliant was a really good exercise for me, especially since thankfully that show isn't trying to be like relevant to the culture. So I can't couch it in anything that's going on politically. I have to just look at the jokes and look how it's being done and being able to talk about it. And that's a really good challenge. And I think that for writers, maybe it would be helpful to like engage with that kind of work. I think that helps you a little bit more with comedy. And then we can come back to the politics part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Appreciate that. Yeah. I also reviewed that season and I found it a challenge on some level as well. I felt lucky that it was one of the few pitches like that was accepted. Because that's a whole other, I don't know, but some of you are writing for places that don't just cover comedy, and there's budget allocation and web traffic and all that stuff that, well, no one's reading your comedy reviews or our comedy coverage as much. So we can't cover that. You know, I get that all the time. Or I used to get that all the time. I kind of gave up because I'm like, this is demoralizing. I love this thing. And I haven't totally given up, but that's a challenge too. Anyway, thank you so much for those observations. Glenn, same question. Glenn, you have a unique position. You're an editor at a magazine, in fact. So you're something of a gatekeeper, I would think, but also have people to answer to. What do you make of this question about comedy and its lack of coverage, I suppose?
I think a lot has to do with money, like the money behind this industry, because, you know, with theater and dance and opera, the companies that produce those, they often get government grants. There are prizes you can win. There are schools that are, you know, churning out people both to do the art and to analyze and critique the art. So there's this big publicity machine behind a lot of these things that, you know, will tell you what's happening, when you can review it, whatever. And in comedy, especially if we're not talking about things like Just for Laughs or big comedy festivals, you know, small clubs, they'll send listings in or whatever, but the coverage that I've given often has come from the comics themselves, who have reached out, found my email address or found me on social media and told me about it. So I think that money hires publicists who then, you know, blanket the media to go see these things, and often And often it just doesn't exist in smaller comedy clubs. And
Yeah.
and again, like I think Jason mentioned it, but people don't take this seriously too. I mean, I think we've probably all felt it, that, the only time your outlet is going to want to write about a comic is when they have a Netflix special or they're suddenly popular because of a movie. It's not because, they had a really tight set. That's a hard sell.
Well, I feel like in my experience, in my trajectory with grassroots journalism, it's gone from we will break someone to we wait till they get broken, because it doesn't it's not worthwhile for us to put our resources into breaking people anymore. This is a blanket statement, but that's my feeling these days. I try, but as an independent journalist myself, I'm like, okay, I love this thing and I'm going to cover it, but I also know it's not going to probably do as well. If I'm thinking of my podcast, for example, I love this, so I'm just going to talk about it. Maybe no one hears it. Hopefully the next episode with the more prominent person draws people to the lesser known person. That's my whole philosophy. It's a complicated landscape. So does anyone want to follow up on anything before we move on? Jason, I see your hand up.
Well, I was going to say what Jourdain said really resonated with me, because it is true. You're often in the situation where a special comes out and you have to figure out, all right, how am I going to cover this? And one of the reasons I think the political angle often ends up, it's the easiest one. And that doesn't mean that, I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in comedy. It's interesting for a number of different reasons. The politics of it is one of them. But it's also true that to just deal with the kind of culture war politics of it is much easier, both in terms of getting a pitch through an editor, sadly, but also in terms of just formally figuring out, all right, what kind of piece I want to write. And this is, I think, a key point, which is that, we've all listened to a lot of comedian podcasts in which comedians think a lot about form, about kinds of jokes, one-liners, storytelling. And I actually think that, now this is the first comedy journalist podcast I've ever been on. I've been on a lot of theater journalist podcasts, but this is a new thing, which is wonderful. And I'm glad you guys did it, because I think the issue of form is as important. And as the hardest questions that I have to answer in terms of how to cover things has to do with form. How do I cover, the form of a joke? How do I not just cover about the hot button subject without ignoring what's important? I think there's also a parallel. I hear a lot of film critics and filmmakers complain that film critics don't talk enough about, I think this is a legit criticism, about the form of the shot choice of a scene, which is actually what, first of all, is really fascinating from a critical point of view. Two, is what artists really spend the most time thinking about. And review, and I think the reason is the structure of the review is such where you have 1,000 words or less, 500 words. You got to get the plot, you got to get your opinion, you have to get a lead and a closer, and you got to get out. So you have time to break down. It's hard. So I think, just to end quickly, one of the advantages we have as being in a newer form is that we can kind of invent it ourselves. There isn't this long history of comedy reviews that sort of looms over us. And we can ask ourselves, all right, so what does it mean what are the different kinds of forms to cover comedy? And they don't have to be, plot this, they can do all sorts of different things. And I think, when I think I'm doing my job well, I'm being more creative with form. And when I think I'm being lazy, I'm not.
I agree about the importance of form. And I mean, that was what was so good about writing about I Think You Should Leave, because it's really all about form. It's like a silly show, but it's all structured and plotted in a specific way that kind of forces you to engage with the jokes, the silliest jokes, and, find the brilliance in them. But I do think that another issue with comedy criticism, and I don't know if we were going to talk about this, but, as a person, I've been a stand-up comic since 2015. And I can say pretty definitively that like a lot of comedians don't like comedy criticism. And I think that that's also an issue too, because when we get this shallow coverage, I think so much of it is like based on like the culture wars and all that. But I also think that a lot of it's based on the fact that like comedians don't really like it when you like really get into it. And it's an interesting thing because like I've been on both sides of it, where it's like I'll be like, I feel like this is like really like bad writing, but then I'll see like comedians getting really angry about a piece of like comedy criticism, and then I'll look at it, I'll be like, yeah, this is good. I think that people are, I don't know if it's like ego related, but there's also just the unwritten comedy thing that if you write about comedy, you're not a real comedian. And I've definitely dealt with it too, where like if I like critique something, somebody's just like, you can't critique anyone who you're not funnier than.
Right.
Like it's considered like, so it just like puts like I've critiqued, you know, like Dave Chappelle and like Chris Rock, and people are just like, but they're Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock. And it's like, yes, I'm aware, like they're super fucking funny. And like I wouldn't be doing comedy if it wasn't for them. However, I think it's weird that, you know, us in the community can't just be like, no, they kind of fucked up here, instead of like building this human wall around them and being so resistant to having a real conversation, because then the relationship between the critic and the comedy community becomes so fraught, and there's just not like a lot of like cohesion there.
There's a lot going, I feel like there's a lot going on in what we're talking about, because I'm hearing little glimmers of, some people have invoked culture wars. I think I can't recall a time when comedy has felt more politicized, because people are always looking to catch people in words they've used and twisting people's jokes into being something other than what they are. That is coupled with the ramping up of anti-intellectualism. I always think comedians are the smartest people I've ever met, but I grew up with people when I was into comedy. I had a friend, a musician, a music fan friend who subsequently became a musician. He hated comedians. How smug you think you are, that you're so funny and smart that you can get up on stage by yourself with a microphone. Who do you think you are, right? And I feel like that, and I used to be like, what is wrong with this person? But I feel like that's where some of the attacks on comedy come from. Like, who does this person think they are, that they can spout off about these things? And then, yeah, I mean, the form part, I think for comedians too, like you're ascribing this much meaning to my joke. Like you're trying to say it's saying this when I'm, you know, how many politicians now say a horrible thing and say, I was just joking? Like they weaponize the jokes. They weaponize comedy. I'm talking about the more nefarious figures in our lives who say, hey, I know I said that or did that. It was all a joke. So like comedy is in a zone now where it's just this target. People use it conveniently.
You're right about people's words being twisted and taken out of context, but I think there's also been a thing where people think that because I'm on stage and I'm behind a mic, it's sort of my opportunity to be an asshole. And it's like, you got to be funny. Like, not that would like excuse like shitty views or anything, but like at the end of the day, it's about being funny.
And I think that like part of someone was mentioning how there isn't really like a template for comedy journalism, and it doesn't have like a very like long history. And I think that that's part of it, because, you know, when comedians get in trouble for saying messed up stuff, you know, they'll obviously first thing they'll be like, but what about Carlin? But what about Pryor? But what about Lenny Bruce? And because there doesn't really seem to be a foundation of this is the social and political context that these comics were in, and this is what they were fighting against. Like, because there's such a flattened understanding of it, people will compare themselves to Richard Pryor and George Carlin. It's like, but you're not them. And they were fighting against the dominant culture. And I find that like we're not really fully defined the dominant culture right now. So people will be like, oh, well, I'm being really edgy. And it's like, no, you're just kind of doing what everybody else is doing, but you're comparing it to a time when it would have been. If there was like more of like a comedy literacy in terms of like historically what was going on, if we could figure out a way to like academically compensate for this huge like gap in knowledge, but I'm not sure how.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're talking about it. That's interesting to me in terms of just the temporal aspect of what we're talking about today, because I don't mean to sound like an old man, but I am an old man. I look like one. But my point is this: we are clearly in the most fractured part of consumerism that we've ever had. No one watches the same news channel. No one. The times you're talking about, if Richard Pryor or Carlin talked about something, everyone knew what they were talking about. Like, it was based on an understanding, mostly. If you were relatively informed, oh yeah, that's what everyone's kind of talking about. We're also, I don't know, Jason, if you have any perspective on this, I'll go to you. But does the fracturing of media, let's call it, and the way we consume things, does that contribute to the lack of central, like, there's not really a central hub for comedy news right now, I don't think. We're all representing different things, but there's not a central hub for anything right now.
But I don't think there ever has been. I think part of our job is to fill in those gaps.
Okay.
Part of our job is to, provide the historical context, explain how what this person's doing isn't the first time, explaining the broader aesthetic context. I would also say that, one of the interesting things is that I feel very lucky. I grew up, my mom ran a theater and she was a director. And I grew up watching her get reviews, right? And one thing first things I learned is that critics are the worst people alive. They're the worst. They're terrible, right? She fucking hated every critic, right?
I'm a good person. I don't feel like a bad person. I feel like a good person myself.
No, but that was the great lesson for me, because I never ever cared if a comedian liked me or not. I want to write for a smart readership, informed, and the respect of people who are informed is important. But I find it because this is not specific to comedy. Everybody in theater hates theater critics. Everybody in opera hates opera critics. Everybody in classical music hates classical. It is universal, right? And if you think of us, it used to be a time when critics didn't know the line about critics was they'd say, you don't know what it's like to take criticism. Can anybody on this panel, we all know what it's like to take criticism because we live in social media and we get inundated with the we know, frankly, better than the artists do most of the time. And I think it's important for, at least for me, I think of like my audience as the readers. And, to the extent that I have like a tribe of people who I'm like, all right, it's these people, it's other comedy critics, other comedy journalists, because I think it's a mistake to judge the quality based on how much comedians like it or don't. That's, the truth is that there is a healthy antagonism between artists and critics and always has been. Because if it was PR, we would just say good things about everybody and no one would trust us.
Yeah.
The reason people trust us is because we're honest. And if you're honest, you're going to say some things are good, some things are bad. And if you say some things are bad, that means that somebody who spent years of their life working on something or months, it could hurt their bottom line. You could get a wrong idea about it. That's just the reality of the sort of structural component of this thing, which is sort of unfair. But I think ultimately, I'm a deep, deep believer in the power of criticism. That I think there has never been a fertile artistic scene of any sort that isn't benefited by having a fertile critical discourse around it. And in my experience, the smarter, savvier artists, the ones who actually are successful, know this.
Right.
And they eventually come around, even if they hate you in that moment. And that's why, like, for instance, if I write a negative review of someone and someone comes back at me, I'm always like, all right, you have your say, because I know what it's like. I wrote a book. My first book I wrote for 5 years, and I got a review from the Times that I thought was stupid. Right. I still hate that guy. Right. Like I'll never forget him. And that's just an emotional response. That's a human response. I get it. It's not a rational. And I think ultimately, as a critic, I have to be worried about being fair to the people I write about, to being empathetic, but ultimately thinking about the readers first, in the same way that comedians are thinking about their audience first.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate that, Jason. Glenn, I want to get your thoughts on what Jason was just saying in the topic.
I really agree. I mean, we're writing for the readers, informed readers who might who have gone to comedy shows. I think it's so difficult now because of social media, because everyone's saying, oh, great show, go to this or whatever. And there's so much sort of PR out there. And let's face it, I mean, for a lot of stand-up comics, especially, they don't need critics. Like, they really don't need the media. With their millions of followers or hundreds of thousands, they can just tag people or tell people that they're going to a certain city and they're going to sell out a place. They don't need necessarily advanced press. They don't need reviews. I do agree that with the smarter comics, with ones who've been around and have really thought about their craft, it can possibly help that, or they might feel gratified that somebody has taken the time and has really thought through what they are trying to do. And, as critics, I think we're trying to describe what they're doing, not to give away punchlines, but maybe pick up on their persona, give some background if we've seen them before. And I think, as we were saying, there's been a dearth of serious comedy criticism. So this might be new to them, but I think if they sit back and aren't in the moment, they can appreciate it for what it is. That we are, we're spending our time, our lives doing this carefully, trying and thoughtfully, not out of spite, not to settle scores, not for, like a negative review or to see it for a certain number of stars, but just to see, how this art form is progressing. And what I had to face early on, I've been writing about comedy on and off for about 20 years, but one of the things I loved is going to larger comedy festivals where you see people from all over the world, because I had to face my little gaps in my knowledge that I might not, respond to a certain kind of humor. And by going, because what is it? You spend an hour just going to see somebody's show that you just don't know, and just to pick up on this and to just broaden your knowledge of what is happening out there. And I think, and that's made me a far better critic too. And I mean, we're talking about how difficult it is to write about comedy, but I always find that improv comedy is one of the most difficult things, because this show will literally never happen again. And how much do you even describe something that won't happen again? So, you can talk about how skillful people are at picking up things, people suggesting things, where it goes. But ultimately, if you relay the plot, it's ridiculous, because that really does exist in the moment. Whereas stand-up comedy will essentially be the same mostly.
That's an interesting point to raise, because I feel like earlier I've talked about different art forms that we cover and critique, music, film, theater. Here's a weird one. Does comedy elicit? Ultimately, I think when we're writing about a review of something, we're talking about how it made us feel. You're talking about feelings more than anything else, I think, in a way. Comedy is weird because you get into I might quote a fact. The thing someone said, I could quote, and it comes across sort of informational or factual. You can do that with a song. You can do that with anything. But I just wonder if, and I'm going to throw this to Jourdain first, because I just wonder if there's something there about the way we convey our feelings about comedy that might be different or something. Because you talked about improv. I have a thing where I decided a long time ago that I was going to just say that one particular thing is the best thing I saw or heard. Like when people say, what's your favorite record? Or what's your favorite band? Of course, I listen to a billion bands. Of course, I love a million comedians, but I just say, I pick one. So in that in that vein, I saw Paul F. Tompkins and Mark Evan Jackson do an improvised thing at JFL 42 in Toronto, and I've never laughed harder in my life. Like I just was not, I didn't know what, and I wrote about it, and it's the most exuberant thing I've ever written because it just filled me with so much joy. And I got on my phone in my car and immediately wrote the review. And I know if I think on it, I have a sense memory that my feeling in the room was on my phone and then in the review. And that's feeling stuff. So anyway, Jourdain, can you speak to this notion that I'm getting at? Do you think there's some distinction about how we viscerally react to comedy as it relates to some of the other forms that seem to get more coverage?
Yeah, I mean, comedy, I don't know. I feel like so much is subjective. Like, I feel like film is subjective, but comedy, I suppose, is the most subjective because it really just depends on, you know, where you're coming from and where the audience is coming from and how they relate to it. Like when I'm doing stand-up, different rooms have different vibes, different groups, you know, like if I'm doing a show in front of an all Black crowd, it's different. And I tailor my comedy differently. And then there are some jokes that like really only make sense to like Black audiences. And then when I do them in front of white audiences or my mixed audiences, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So, I mean, like, there is an element, there's the fact that there's like so much of it is subjective and so much of it is emotional. And a lot of people, when they consume culture, they think about like what's relatable to me. And that can be good and bad. That can be helpful or a hindrance. Like if it's very relatable to you, it can mean that as a writer, your perspective on it can be very singular in the sense that, and you know, and maybe the comic will read and just be like, yes, this person really gets it. And then there are some things that are just like not really like, there are some things that, because like there's sometimes something is funny, but the audience doesn't really understand what's funny about it, the context of it. And, you know, sometimes I've done a show and I'll just be like, they didn't laugh. And then like someone, like another comic will just be like, it's just this audience, like, you know, and in front of a different audience, it'll be different. I mean, it's not just that like audiences only know what they know, you know, like they can be, an audience would have to watch so many different kinds of comics to really get like a wider berth of what's going on. But sometimes sometimes a joke doesn't travel. Sometimes it just doesn't translate. And sometimes it's all in delivery. Like there's material that's like hard to understand for some people, but it's the way that it's delivered. Like when I see Patty Harrison do stand-up, which I did like right before she blew up, like, you know, she was coming at it from a trans woman's perspective, and she was doing jokes specifically about being trans, and the rooms that I was in were mostly queer and trans people, and like we were all like getting our life, like we were having a great time. But you know, but I don't know like how that comedy would work in a different room, or how people would react if they don't have that context of like where she's coming from, you know?
No, it's a great point about relatability. Absolutely. I thank you for that. Claire, similar question, and picking up where we just were, but also I was thinking about how I framed this question, but I guess where I'm getting at is it more difficult to explain why something made us laugh as critics than maybe how it made us feel? I know those are intertwined reactions, but can you speak to that at all, Claire?
Yeah, I'll try. I know that personally I find it easier to write about a special if I feel strongly about it. Like if it really like evoked an emotion, like not just because I'll watch a special and I'll be like, yeah, sure, they were funny, but I don't feel strongly about it. And it's like, okay, it feels like you're eking out words. But and Jourdain's right that like part of like what, you know, makes you feel strongly about something, it's like, well, it's my own personal experience, like, or how I relate to it, or what I find of value in comedy. Like that's so subjective. And yeah, I don't know. It's just like, it's it's very subjective. And I guess when people are writing about like what's funny in a joke or whatever, rather than just like not as in breaking down the jokes, but when people are writing about what's funny, they'll be like, oh, I laughed out loud at this line. And it's like, did you really? Or are you just writing that because it's an easy way to express that like this was the funniest thing in the special to you? So I'm going to say
it's interesting. I think it's true though. I think you're both saying like your own lived experience will prompt that reaction. Like your own, that's what you're going to find funny, or what you relate to the most is going to make you react, I guess. And the thing that you're like, I don't know what that reference is. That's not been I've never done that. Like that's the stuff where you're like, oh, it kind of lost me in the set when they talked about hang gliding. I've never done that, like, what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I did a set recently where I talked about, because I'm Jamaican, I talked about how the UK owes Jamaica a lot of money, but a lot of people don't know that. So like I was telling the joke and maybe like one person got it, but like it was something that was like constantly on my mind. It's something that I constantly think about. When is the UK going to run Jamaica a check? But it's like, I mean, it's an American audience. Maybe it would work better in the UK. Maybe it would work worse. Maybe they'd be angry at me for pointing it out. So, I mean, it really just depends. The whole rest of the set went great, but that was like the one joke everybody was just like, what?
Yeah, colonialists are not very funny, or they don't like it when you point out the colonialism. I find that all the time myself. It's not good. I want to throw to Jason and Glenn as well to speak to my potentially weird tangent about feelings and criticism. Jason, did you want to speak to what we've been discussing at all?
Well, I mean, I think feelings are certainly a part of it, but I don't think that's, I actually, maybe this is a weird point of view, but I don't think that comedy is more about feelings or emotions than intellectual ideas than, say, visual art or theater. I really don't. I think people have very emotional responses to a painting and very subjective responses to, a play or a movie. I think the challenge for a critic, right, is that you're writing for an audience yourself, and you are of course limited by your own subjectivity and your own biases. And it's why but if you're only defined by that, then you're not of that much use to a broad audience. So how do you get around that problem? Well, one, you have to constantly be investigating your own taste, your own biases. And that can be a complicated thing. And it doesn't, I think, often work. If anything, I think I err on the side of, if there's a comedian who I know is directly in my taste, I'm probably more skeptical or more of my own opinion than somebody who is totally different than me, which I'll be like, oh, I'll just give them more of the benefit of the doubt. So it's not predictable how you do that. But I also think you have to develop as a critic systems to not just be limited to your own feelings. So for instance, my process is I'll see a work and I'll say, okay, before I even get to what, of course there's your immediate emotional response, whether you liked it or not, I'm alert to that. And that matters independently of anything intellectually. But then I try to, after I sort of check that, I say, okay, what was this artist trying to do? And I really spent a lot of time thinking, like, let me have a really good faith, even if I think they're terrible. What were they trying to do? What was the intention of the artist? With the knowledge that I can never actually answer the question because I'm not inside their head. But I find it invaluable to spend a lot of time thinking about that. It helps me in the next step, which is, did they succeed at that? Right. And then the last step, which is, all right, is that something worthwhile? Some people set out to do something, they succeeded, but it's not worthwhile at all, or it's the opposite. Some people, and that has to do with, I think, a really important question, which is ambition, which is like, I have a bias, and most critics do, towards ambition. If someone's doing something more ambitious, I tend to reward them more. If it's more modest or more, kind of rote and hack, then it's that is factored in as well. So these are all things that are, I think, transcend the sort of subjective feelings of it and get to like, all right, what is the craft of criticism? And how do we speak to many audiences? And And, oftentimes after you go through this whole process, you end up often in the exact same place what your original emotional response is. And in fact, like Pauline Kael, who was like my favorite critic, who inspired me to become a critic, she would always write a review really fast. She'd go to see a screening of a movie, and she took pride in not spending a lot of time overly intellectualizing it. She wanted to write it fast because she didn't want that much distance between her reaction and thinking about it. And so that's something I also think about as being like, that's a worthwhile.
I think so too.
That's a worthwhile, it's this balancing act of not just being limited by your own initial reactions, while also being very sensitive and alert to them.
Well, this is where I started getting into this habit of writing reviews in my car on my phone for music, and everything else was the comedy reviews. I thought, what is going to change? My instinctual reaction is not going to change. I mean, I might think about it differently in a week or something, but I just wanted to get it done. And my editor would be like, I'd submit it, and he'd be like, "Didn't you just see that show like an hour ago?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's my feeling. I think it's done." So I subscribe to that as well. I'm just being mindful of the. Go ahead, Glenn.
Your editors must have loved you, Vish.
He did. He did for a while. No one really loves me. No, sorry, Glenn. I'm kidding. No, my wife loves me. She's right upstairs. I can bring her down if you want to meet. Anyway, my point is this. Glenn, did you want to speak to what we've been talking about?
I'd agree with Jason. I mean, I think we're confronted with so many different kinds of art, of approaches to this art, and I think you just have to be really open and going through those same three things. But also, I think that we sort of develop an instinct about whether it is truthful, whether they are just saying the words that are funny words, or whether they do believe them, and there is some part of their soul in this. And I think we often respond to that wherever it is on the political spectrum, and we just think, this is honest, and I think that often makes it so much funnier and more authentic and believable. So I think it's just you sort of developed this sort of instinct about that. And you respond to it. There's nothing like that. There's nothing like a comic. I mean, one of the joys of covering comedy for over many years is just when a stand-up comic, especially, or a sketch troupe, they've been around for a while, but when they turn that corner and they find their voice and they find what they really want to say, it is so satisfying. Yeah. I'm almost getting teared up here because I've seen that happen. I've seen, you're not quite there. You're not quite there. And then boom, it's like, wow, you have found it. And I'm a huge fan now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well said, Glenn. I appreciate that. Here's a question from Cassie. How do you write about comedy without spoiling jokes? As Vish said. Okay, that was very early on. I have thoughts on this. Obviously, I broached it, but Claire, what do you think of that?
So I think we've talked about it in some ways, and I remember that was one of the first things the comedy editor at Paste, Garrett, told me when I started writing about comedy. It was like, just the main thing, don't include the jokes. And I was like, okay. But talking about like form, like we've said, and pacing, sometimes I almost like instinctually run through like a checklist in my head, like, do they do crowd work? Are they good at it? Like, do they clearly have a rapport? Just like, their presence, and it might sound like weirdly simple at first, but like, are they going fast? Are they going slow? Like just stuff like that, just the actual craft of it, and, who you think they'll appeal to, and like, where they've come from, like including like the context of like their past and everything. And just, that's about it.
No, that was good. That was good.
I might have a slightly different take on that, which is that I don't like, for instance, if you were reviewing a movie, there's this idea of spoilers, right? And most people agree that means like giving away the end of the plot, right? Maybe people disagree, but no one thinks that first of all, I don't like spoiler culture, period. But exactly. But nobody thinks that you can't reveal any plot to a movie. And in fact, you would think that would be a really bad review, because part of the job of a movie review is to give a sense of what you're going to see, right? So I kind of feel like this idea of, again, I've talked to many comedians about this, and I don't ultimately, and it's use, and I think about it a lot. I don't want to give away too much, but this idea that you give away no punchlines, no jokes. I think it's because and this is what with a comedian, I've had like one or two be like, yes, once you give away a punchline, it ruins it. Two things. One, if you give no punchlines, then every review of it is going to make it not sound funny. Is that what you want? No. Okay. If it's a good review, you want it to sound funny. All right. That's independent of what I actually care about, which is my readers. I want to give an accurate portrayal of what this person is like. Two, I think I think on the other hand, they have the second point is a punchline on paper doesn't read the same as spoken. I can't really steal a punchline if I put it in a newspaper. It does. I could try to recreate some of the pacing of it, but it's not the exact same thing. So I actually don't think it totally is. All that being said, I am very careful to not reveal too many, and I'm sensitive to it, but I mean, it's an ongoing battle. I often be like, if anything, my editors are like, I would like to get more jokes in here so I can get a sense of what it's like. And I'm like, well, we already have 2 jokes in this 1,000-word thing. We don't want to. So I actually think there's a lot of gray area there. And I think, but interestingly, I think I had more problems with this early in my career. Now, when comedians themselves all have to sell their own stuff, have to take a special, take jokes and use it to sell it on TikTok or whatever, they get this. No. And then moreover, as soon as Ali Wong has a special out, there's somebody on the internet who has an entire transcript of it that you can find online. So people are not pure, people are sensible and reasonable about this issue, or more so than they have been in years past. But that said, I'm sensitive to it. Anyways.
I think that I can see your point of view on a lot of what you said. The only thing I would argue is that I don't think of spoilers as necessarily the ending. I think it's spoiling the plot twist, the surprise. Question from Sarah. Thank you, Sarah. If you're producing local comedy shows, what's your advice to best get a reviewer in? Is it only worth it if it's a recurring event or something with a long run? Does anyone have any particular insight on this? I know I see faces being made. Does anyone want to speak? The
editors could speak to this better.
Yes, maybe Glenn, do you want to talk about it?
So what was it? Your advice?
If you're producing local comedy shows, what's your advice to best get a reviewer in? I mean, I think best way to attract a reviewer to come out. And there's a follow-up question, but is it only worth it if it's a recurring event or something with a long run?
I mean, back when I was reviewing stand-up comics fairly regularly, they would often have like a 3 or 4 night run at a bigger club. So I would try to make it on that first night. So the review would go up the next day or the day after. So there'd still be, a show for people to see and to use that review practically. So, I mean, I guess so. I mean, what I always tell comics if I get emails or something is just, like what are the dates coming up that you have? So not just one, because if I go and review it, how are people going to see you again? And with comedy festivals too, it's just like, what use will it be if I review this at this festival and people can't go see it again? So again, I'm thinking in terms of the comedy lover out there who might, be checking to see, I've got Sunday night free and this show is happening. Let's see what there is. So
we're getting into the existential crisis of what is the point of a review in the first place? Because I know in my experience, I always was like, when I went to university, the newspaper was like, we never preview anything. We only talk about a show once it's gone. I'm like, what is the point of that? And they're like, well, if they want to preview it, they can pay for advertising. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, this isn't how anything should work. Don't to foster galvanization in your community and push people to the events. They won't happen if no one's there. This is from Andy. Is there a genuine problem with people? Oh, sorry. Yeah. Is there a genuine problem with people with no understanding of comedy reviewing it, though? There sometimes seems to be a real disconnect between criticism and audiences and the comedy community. Huh. Who wants to tackle this one?
I mean, I don't. It's not like comedy criticism is like a thing that people go to school for. Like, there's not like a lot of them, really. So I don't know about that. I mean, I do think that, like, from the comedy perspective, I've watched a lot of like comedians that I know and comedians that I don't know just be like, "Oh, you don't understand comedy." But I don't necessarily think that that's true. I don't really think that anybody that writes about comedy doesn't understand it. I think there is issues with communicating that understanding. But I don't know. I don't really think so. It makes me think a lot about, there is a comedy journalist who mostly covers like labor in comedy, which we haven't really talked anything about. And the usual criticism lobbied at that person, whose name I will not say, is that they do not understand comedy. And I don't think that that's necessarily true, but I do think that people will laser focus on certain aspects instead of being able to get like the full breadth of it. But because there isn't we can't like look back and be like, here's one of the greatest comedy journalists of our time. Like, we don't know who that is. So it's hard to know like what the template is to communicate your thoughts.
Right. All right. Well said. I don't know if we necessarily have a sketch comedy legend in our midst necessarily, but someone named Lorraine Newman is asking, how constrained are you as journalists when it comes to defending someone's material that you think is unfairly canceled? This is happening all the time now, I would say. Who wants to take this one?
I'll take it just because.
Go ahead.
First of all, Lorraine Newman, this is exciting. Original member, cast member of Saturday Night Live.
You think it's really Lorraine?
I think it's really Lorraine.
That's amazing. Hi, Lorraine. Big fan. Huge fan. Thank you for being here.
If it really is Lorraine, I love you. I think you're great. I have the 70 seasons of SNL in my apartment right now.
Me too. I know I was showing this off, but I didn't know Lorraine. I can go get my DVDs. I have them downstairs. Sorry about that. Anyway, I don't mean to derail us. Jason, did you want to speak to Lorraine's question?
I guess I'm not sure. In my experience, editors are dying for you to write about canceled people or about cancel culture or any of that stuff. Yeah, I mean that you can just tell if you read the media how often it comes up and how clumsily it's used to describe. So I don't find that I'm not particularly interested in like I find like the particularly in comedy where I think a lot of it is marketing at this point. I mean, if you it adds a kind of veneer of danger to a show, and it's become so commonplace for people to lead with it that anyways, I find it often not the most interesting part of it. But no, I don't find that hard. I mean, it can be anyways, yeah, I think that especially like whatever in the last 5 years, the number of people who've been who've been in controversies in comedy is so large. You could spend all your time writing about these comedy controversies, and some people do. So I don't know. I'd be curious what other people have to say about it.
I think Jourdain may have something to say about this.
This might be controversial, but I don't actually think that cancellation is a thing. I feel like an old woman whenever I say this. Was just like, on my day, it was just like, but really, the word, I hate it. The idea of it, I hate it. I think that there are comedians who, and I mean, in terms of like cancellation, like as a concept, it's often referred to a comedian who has been doing this for a while, has made a lot of money, and is now out of step with culturally where people are at on certain topics. And so I don't really find like, there were people will reject it. I know that as a comedy producer, I used to produce a show in Queens for about 2 years, and it was really hard to get people to come because there was this idea of comedy that a lot of people have, at least a lot of like the intellectuals that I know have this, just like, oh, it's lowest common denominator. People are just going to say offensive things. And my show particularly, I didn't book men on my show. That was kind of like that was my hook. I didn't at all. And so it was like every week somebody had to watch comedy done by women and non-binary, gender non-conforming people. And people would come up afterwards and just be like, wow, like it's nice to go see comedy where it's like nobody's saying something like offensive, which I thought was really funny. I don't necessarily think that that's true, but I do think that there's this idea that the more offensive you are, the more like dangerous you are, and cancellation is a response to disliking that danger. But I don't really think that it's danger necessarily. I think it's people realizing, I mean, like for like Chappelle, for example, like if we're talking about the 2000s, he was coming from a place of, these are the ways that Black people are seen in comedy and media. And that was his criticism. And that was like where he had his most interesting insights. And I mean, like Black people in general, I mean, he never really had anything interesting to say about Black women at all. That's like, that's another thing that I feel like people don't ever mention. But like now his beat isn't really talking about Black people. He's talking about subjects that have nothing to do with him and subjects that he does not understand. And so I don't really think that he's being canceled. I think that people are just like, you no longer have the insight that made you brilliant. And I feel like that's getting conflated with like this kind of like culture war dialogue that I think is actually really useless to criticism, just like really takes away from it. It's anti-intellectual. It's, it's just way more honest to be like, sometimes people go on stage and don't know what they're talking about. And you can not know what you're talking about and be funny. But if you are known for knowing what you're talking about, and then you're talking about shit that you don't understand, yeah, that's going to change the way that people are going to engage with your comedy.
That's super incisive and fascinating to me. I hadn't thought of it. I'm someone who saw Dave Chappelle. I've seen him numerous times live and counted myself a fan, but I hadn't really thought of the notion that he's out of his wheelhouse, and that's why he's sputtering and struggling, and evil is sort of coming out, if you will, or some different part of him. That's really, really fascinating. I'm sorry, in the interest of time, Glenn, I saw your hand up. Did your hand flash up there for a second? Please go ahead.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, that was a really good point about Chappelle, Jourdain. I mean, we talk a lot about safe spaces and, trigger warnings and things before shows. I'm sure, Jason, going to the theater, you get a lot of those too. But, and there are a lot of local shows in Toronto where there are like, I think, no rape jokes. There are certain things that you just do not bring to the table, and no man, which is fine. But I think that if you are going to cover the beat, in a full way, you sort of have to see the full range of comedy that's out there. And what I've missed, especially during the pandemic when JFL, Just for Laughs, didn't come to town, is like the Nasty Show. Remember, they used to have like the bluest material or whatever, and I would go there almost like a horror fan. Just, I mean, no judgment there, but I just wanted to see what do you think is the nastiest, the bluest you can go? And I just find it fascinating. And again, not all of it's going to work, but it comes down to, does this material fit with the persona of this comic? Do you really believe that they're saying this, or are they just trying to shock people? So, you know, I kind of miss those, and I hope they don't go away, because I think that I think comics at their best should be able to push boundaries, to talk about things that people don't talk about, and I am a little scared that's it's sort of being muffled.
I think there's a fear like we've hinted at it a few times. I think sometimes critics are afraid to say how they really feel. I think everyone's just afraid to be caught in saying something that leads to any kind of backlash or what have you. It's just the nature of where we're all kind of navigating what to say and how to say it, and sometimes it's. Yeah, I'm with you on it, Glenn. Like I'm all for free expression, but there's checks and balances now, which I think are also good. It's a very fascinating time. Daniel Lesage asks, how do you navigate a review when your feelings/instincts greatly differ from the reaction of the audience? And Margarita Brighton, in a similar kind of question, asks, has there ever been a time when you wanted to take back a review that you posted to the public? Has there ever been a time when you regretted a review you wrote? So getting into more like, what are we doing with these reviews?
No, this is, I guess, also building upon both, I think, Glenn and Jourdain's last points, which both were really smart. The job, if you look, occasionally you'll have, and Chappelle's a perfect example, where it got a lot of bad reviews. And then some people would say, but the audience loved it, or it got high ratings, right? And what's so strange to me about that is that to the extent that we're useful at all, right? And maybe we're not, maybe we're totally pointless, right? To the extent we're useful at all, it is that we have a independent, point of view that doesn't perfectly comport with the audience or the algorithm. That's criticism has never and never will be. No one wants to come read a reflection of what exactly the audience thinks. That's what the box office returns are for. Nobody thinks that the best movies are, of the last year are the top 10 Marvel movies which made the most money. There's a reason that historically reviews they're supposed to be different than what the audience says. So, you're right. You're 100% right that everyone is like trying to navigate, the current, what the landscape. But I actually do believe very strongly that if you are going into a critic, if you're going into a life of being a critic because you want to be liked, or you want to not take, not annoy people with telling them things they like is, have issues or things that they do like, you're making a mistake. Part of your job is to honestly reflect and what you think about this work and have very high standards. And it's now that said, I do think it's very interesting what an audience response is. And oftentimes I'll even incorporate that into a piece because you can learn a lot from an audience. By the way, comedians have the exact same issue, which is to say that Chris Rock knows that you can't, he builds his material based on audience response. But when you're that famous, they laugh at everything. So how do you figure out if your work is good or not? Well, the way he does it is he just kind of when he goes to clubs, he just sort of rattles off in a kind of rote way. He makes his jokes worse than they are, and it still doesn't totally work. But smart comedians know, especially when they get famous, to have a healthy distrust of the audience. You have to listen to them, pay attention to what the response is, but also know that, every audience is different. Audience that can be manipulated like anything else. And it's certainly not the job of the critic, in my opinion, to merely reflect what the audience thinks.
One of my gigs right now, it has been for many years, is reviewing SNL. And when something gets an applause break or a groan, I'm mostly talking about Weekend Update right now. I try to articulate it. I try to sort of say like Che or Jost like tried something and that was really great. Like it got a huge break. So I think just sort of it's a way of sort of articulating that this resonated with a room full of people, and whether it was good or bad. And I think it's sort of I think subconsciously I'm trying to humanize the experience. Yeah. Maybe like other humans, not just me right now, everyone. Other humans sort of reacted in a certain way. I think maybe that's what we're doing. Like, anyway, I'm not going to psychoanalyze what we're doing. Jason, you were going to say something to me?
Well, no, I was saying you're reporting. You're doing an active reporting about what happened there, which is an important thing to do.
Yeah.
But that's distinct from what criticism is, which
that's
doesn't
true.
say that it doesn't incorporate it. But there's news and there's criticism, and so look, particularly if you've been to shows when they tape, you really see how manufactured some of this stuff can be. Not to say that there isn't a human reaction, but every one of those is, particularly those TV shows, they're highly controlled particular environments.
No, they are. It's definitely mediated. And I agree with that part of it. Claire, you were the one nodding the most adamantly that I should call on people to speak to things. Did you want to speak to anything that we've just been talking about?
So, I mean, I definitely agree with Jason that like, you're not there to be like, oh, well, the audience of this is funny, so it must be great. Like that's not your job at all. But noticing what the audience reacts to is interesting and like can be of value. No, the reason I was nodding was like, would you ever take back a review? I would never take back any of my comedy reviews. I stand by them. My only one is I should have been more prepared. I wouldn't take it back. I did a bad one about Taylor Swift, but that's not comedy. But I did get attacked by Swifties. That was fun.
Oh, no.
she can be funny. Maybe never mind. Okay, yeah. So does anyone else want to speak to this before we wrap up? Glenn?
Well, maybe not taking back reviews, but sort of missing the boat on people. Like, I don't think when Nathan Fielder, he grew up in Toronto, when he was doing his stuff, I admired that sort of anti-comedy stuff that some of his colleagues were doing, but I didn't quite get it. So I own up that I didn't really get his humor before. I mean, there was a running joke because the long-running comedy critic before I started doing it didn't get the Kids in the Hall. So we didn't put them on the cover until way after they had broken. And so, those were things that I think the paper as a whole sort of regretted, but
you didn't put them on the cover until they like reunited, I think, right?
Yeah, exactly. I know.
I'm not holding you to account right now. I'm just saying the facts are the facts, and you missed the boat. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, I'm just kidding. We have to wrap up. Does anyone have a podcast or a show or something they want to feel like am I the only one?
I do Bad Romance Podcast, which is a comedy podcast about bad romantic movies. I do it with another comedian, Bronwyn Isaac. We've been doing it for like 5 years. So yeah, there are a lot of episodes. We've covered a lot of rom-coms.
Nice. Yeah, cool. I have a podcast called Creative Control with K's. So as I say, primarily interviews with musicians, comedians, and authors. Who knows? Unless I've offended anyone here, maybe one of them will be on the show sometime. I have no idea. I want to say thank you to everyone who's joined us and for coming to TO Sketchfest. And thanks again to CBC for supporting the Learning and Fun program. Panel, you've been wonderful as far as I'm concerned. I know I'm not getting good reviews, but I'll take that into account. Thank you very much for being here. And I wish you all the best luck in the future. Bye, everybody.
Watch, Vish. This is a lot of fun.
Thanks, Vish.